Welcome to As Built, the podcast about architecture firms and buildings and how both get built. I'm your host, Brian Jones.
Yep.
My guest today is partner at Krueck Sexton Partners, Don Semple. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So let's dive into some questions today. How did you first connect with Krueck Sexton Partners, and what drew you to seek a position there?
I spent most of my childhood in Kansas and was a student at Kansas State University. In my third year of college, I had a professor named Bob Condia, really great professor, very artistic in nature. And he had not a studio, but a kind of a side course that people could take that was called delineation in architecture. And in that course, we studied different mediums and traditional mediums, not digital. I know we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the digital world, but at one point in my career, I was into watercoloring and hand work. And I took this class from Professor Condia. And at one point during the semester, we studied other architects' drawings, techniques. And Mark and Ron had done these really beautiful stippled drawings in the late 80s. So if you look at like the painted apartment drawings and there's some other projects, Donet Showroom, where they basically put in watercolor into rapidographs, and then they did these kind of hand stippled gradations of color and of shade and shadow to create these drawings. And so that was my introduction to the firm. Being a kid from Kansas, I really didn't have any exposure to the firm prior to that point. And still the firm at that point, I think we had done Crown Fountain, but largely our body of work was mostly residential, kind of high-end residential. So I think beyond Chicago, the firm didn't necessarily have that high of a profile. We had just one Spertus Institute, which was a major project that I was part of me being hired was just the workload from that project and needing some additional staff. So my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, was really interested in getting out of Kansas. And it happened to be a good time because it was 2006, before the recession. Lots of people were hiring, and there were a lot of job offers out there. And we kind of have had the benefit of being really selective about where we wanted to go. And Ron and Mark's office was just one at the top of my list, just because, again, just the quality of the drawing work was just so beautiful, and then the executed work is even more so. So that's kind of what drew me in, and I was fortunate enough to land a position there, being a kid from Kansas. And we have a wide variety of different backgrounds that come into our office, but we kind of come from an IIT kind of footing. And so Ron and Mark obviously have had a long history with IIT. We did the renovation of Crown Hall a number of years ago, and kind of stem from that Miesian thing. So for a kid that went to Kansas State to get a job at Krueck Sexton was a little unusual at the time, but I've really, really enjoyed my time there.
So you've spent a few years at the firm, and you've transitioned from architect to partner. And what was that transition like?
I would kind of compare it to getting married in a way, like, just because in a sense, like when two people have been together for a long time, your relationship doesn't necessarily change dramatically overnight, right? So it's not something where the day you walk in as partner, all of a sudden there's some different kind of relationship that you have within the office, right? Our desire, my desire to become partner in of itself was just this about helping the continuation of this practice. And just because I've loved working here for so long, I love who I work with, I love my other partners, we have incredibly talented staff. And so becoming invested in the firm and purchasing in was about just making that continuity. And from a standpoint of going from staff to one of the partners, it does change things, but more so over the long term as other pressures are applied to the practice, like when you start to get into the financial stability of the office and how you make decisions that have long-term impact on your employees and on the work you're able to do. That obviously changes with the partnership role. But I think we had the group of us that came in as new partners. We had been part of leadership within the office for a number of years at that point. And so it was not necessarily, it was a change of title, again, that the rest of the world kind of recognizes, but it wasn't necessarily a change in how we were operating the office fundamentally, that we were still part of leadership before and then continue to be part of leadership. So
you mentioned it a little bit at the top of the show, but your role at the firm includes developing new ways to use technology. How did that role come about, and what are some examples of how the use of technology has evolved?
Yeah, so again, going back in time to when I started now, it's hard to believe that's almost 20 years, but
Flies.
when I came into the profession, I think a lot of us at that time that kind of came into the profession, a lot of the reason that we were looking to be hired was just the fastness with which we knew technology. And I think our generation, it was kind of the first generation that had computers from a relatively young age. Didn't necessarily weren't computers around when we were born, but had computers from a relatively young age, and were able to learn and adapt relatively quickly to their use. And when I came in, it was a very distinct kind of division of labor within the office, just in a sense that your managers really had very, it's not to say they were technologically illiterate. I mean, many of them are quite capable, but just the speed with which they were able to adapt and learn new programs is just kind of a completely different thing, right? So I think it's, I mean, you see it with, I have a child, you see it with kids, right? It's, I mean,
Sure.
my son, when he was like 3 years old, thought everything was a touchscreen. He just assumed everything was a touchscreen just because that's the reality of the
More
world
real.
around him and the technology, right? So again, as I mentioned, I came from a college where I was really into hand drawing and really into watercoloring and all of that. But again, being of that generation, had a particular facility. And then through the recession, 2008, 2009, we were very, very lean. And I was by far the youngest person on staff at that point, and just assumed, everybody just assumed that I knew how to use technology. And so much of the leadership position had to do with, well, it's like, where do you think we're going, Don? Just because you kind of have your hand on the pulse of where things are going. Ron Krueck is like really interested in transparency and layering and all these things. And so a lot of our work, we have these patterns. And again, if you refer back to like the painted apartment or Thonet or other things, there's this idea of kind of layering transparency and translucency, and the idea of using that to kind of modulate space. And we were doing all this pattern work, and so much of it was so intensive. Ron has never seen a drawing that he couldn't refine, right? I mean, he just has this kind of instinct where there's always something that can be improved about a drawing. And so you go through, and we were using CAD at the time or something, and you go through and do this drawing, and it was very laborious to figure out a gradation and how these things are blending and all this stuff. And then you would need to make some minor correction, and you'd have to go back from scratch and like redraw. And it was just kind of this brute force methodology. And so we had started to use Rhino back in like 2007, something like that, which was incredibly transformational. I mean, just the speed at which you're able to kind of work through different options, and kind of how smoothly you're able to kind of work through that is amazing. But then Grasshopper had just come about, which is this algorithmic programming, kind of visual programming plugin on top of Rhino. And I just kind of just was curious and just started digging into it. And it was really early on. I mean, a lot of it was like, if you wanted to do certain things, you had to be able to kind of look into a little bit of coding also, because there was kind of a limited amount of components that you actually had available within Grasshopper at the time. And so I just kind of went head into it, and it was really just to figure out, is there a way that we can utilize something that where we can create these iterations, create these versions of design. And this particular point, it was really more graphic in a sense that you're creating these kind of layers of translucency with glass patterns and metal perforation patterns and other things like that, and automate it basically. And not even necessarily automation is probably a bad word, but it's just to say that to be able to crank through these much quicker. And so in that sense, also kind of extract yourself from the brute force labor of it, and become a little bit more objective in the actual viewing of those things, which again is something that Ron has, this kind of a natural gift, this ability to kind of always be able to look for refinement. But as a young designer, invariably, if you put a bunch of time into something, you kind of fall in love with it, and you kind of hate to see. It's like to have to redo it and redo it and redo it, right? Is this thing that's just tough as a young designer. I think this ability to create a workflow that where it's just much smoother and more efficient, and actually allowed for more kind of real time interaction with Ron and Mark at the time too, because they could see the adjustment right away, right? So
Yeah.
there was not this like, let's try this, and then 3 hours later come by your desk again, right? It was like, okay, I can adjust this slider in Grasshopper, and all of a sudden now I can see what changed, right? And
Yeah.
and then it's like, well, maybe I meant this. And so I think that's where it started. And then I think that kind of got me into kind of a philosophy of technology of like figuring out like, okay, how can I work such that like I spend more time thinking and less time just doing busy bee stuff, and finding ways that I can optimize my workflows, not in a sense of like to try to be home earlier, but to really try to find ways where I can spend more time thinking and more time crafting and less time actually doing just the kind of the brute force stuff. So
So shifting gears a little bit to the firm at large, one of the firm's prime differentiators um, is the ability to see hidden potential of a project. What role do you think that technology plays in that?
I would say technology plays a role in the sense that we're big believers in work process. I mean, Ron and Mark and all the current partners, we're not napkin sketch people who just draw something up and then expect everybody to execute it, right? So like a lot of where our projects end up come through churn. We draw a lot, and then we put stuff up on the wall, and we stand back and try to be as objective as possible about it, and then make decisions, and then draw more options, right? And so I mentioned Rhino is key to a lot of our design practice. We find that there's just a fastness with which people can work in it, that it reduces the time it takes to get it from your head onto something that people can see, and you can communicate it, right? And so that ability to really dig into a project and understand grade and climate and all of these different things doesn't, I don't think, come from like some aha moment. It comes from just this kind of continuity of working through problems and solutions, and then standing back and looking at those things. And so the speed with which you're able to work through that stuff, I mean, the kind of fastness with which you're able to work, I think is really critical to like how far you can take a solution, and therefore how much you can really discover about a particular project and its opportunities. So thinking about, we did a embassy edition in Kenya, and there's 9 meters of grade there, and a very limited site and very constrained, and a lot of the solution is it's a sectional solution. The whole project is about the section, and that came through this uncovering of how you could use the grades to facilitate all these different programmatic requirements within the project. And that as this kind of hidden potential, it's like, well, it's this combination of this program and this site and this ability to kind of really work through a lot of iteration, not only on a computer, we also build physical models, but to get back to kind of where I started with this, to say, I don't think it's only part of finding kind of hidden potential within projects. I think we are, for the industry, I would say we're a very humble group, and we listen a lot. And so a lot of our best ideas for projects come from the clients, come from the amazing consultants that we've worked with. We have our project that we did, the FBI project down in Miramar, Grogan Dove. And the idea of the wetland came from our landscape architects, right? And it wasn't to say the way in which it was executed, which, has this kind of duality of providing security and also restoration of land, was the landscape architect's idea, but it was just this idea that, hey, this was former wetland area, and they brought that to the table, and I was like, oh, that kind of set off the proverbial bells, and we were just like, okay, let's really dig into that and see kind of where that would take us. And so I think and again, I think there are a lot of practices out there that are more humble. I think the caped architects tend to get a little bit more notoriety, but I think for us, really approaching it as humble, and realizing your best idea could come from anybody. Obviously, people with more experience maybe have more relevant ideas per se, but like from your interns to your clients to your consultants to whoever, great ideas could come out of that. And so I would say hidden potential is this combination of like remaining open to everything that's being communicated across the team and all the stakeholders, combined with just a kind of a work ethic that is really facilitated through this kind of speed with which you're able to work through solutions. And again, go back to the pattern thing, this ability to remain objective is really key, because like again,
Yeah,
the longer it takes you to do something, the more attached you naturally become to it. It's just like a human nature thing. And so
sure.
the quicker you're able to get through stuff and put stuff up and really look at it in some type of objective way, is the way in which you can really progress. So
So, in the course of your career so far, how have the changes of technology shaped the practice, do you think? You've talked a little bit about the speed and the ability to realize, but do you think that there are other impacts that have happened as a result of that?
yeah, for sure. I mean, I speak mostly of good things. I think one of the things where I see a huge difference now between where we were in the CAD age and where we are in the BIM age is like in the CAD age, every drawing you printed out was just like the line weights were way too heavy. And that's because everybody was zooming in to an infinite point and drawing the threads on bolts and stuff like that. And there was, until you got to the point where you're plotting, did you realize, okay, you can't actually see any of that I was drawing, right? And there's this kind of idea of this like infinite scale with CAD that I think was
Mm,
really detrimental in a way. And to the profession, just because again I think so much of what we do is about communicating design, right? And if somebody can't see it, then you're obviously not communicating it. And so I think that's a big shift now with Revit, right? And in other BIM programs where you're kind of starting at scale, right? And you're always kind of working at a particular scale, which is much more in line with where things were when people are hand drawing. There was never a drawing that you did where it was an infinite scale, right? You were always working at a particular scale on a particular size of page, and you had to think about layout, you had to think about your text, you had to think about notes, you had to think about tags, you had to think about all of that stuff
sure.
as part of a composition, right? And so I think where we are now with BIM, the one thing I do see is that a lot of drawings become artifacts of a 3D element, right? So like instead of drawing a section, people are kind of creating sections as kind of these like byproducts of a modeling process. And so I think for us and how we're working with our young architects and design associates is really about making sure people are crafting a section, and it's not just this drawing that you cut, this section mark that you put on the plan, and all of a sudden you have a section, right?
Right.
And so I think that's kind of a challenge of things. The level of coordination we can get now with BIM, and we had this wonderful BIM coordinator, Michael Fametter, that works for us, that is just phenomenal, is amazing. And just again, I think the standards that we are able to deploy from a standpoint of not rethinking how we're doing our general notes and rethinking how we're doing our keynotes and rethinking that every time we approach a project, which we're we're typical architects where it's like, and again, go back to the Ron Sperry, there's always a better way, right? And so we will re-engineer that wheel as many times as it takes. But I think again, to go back to say, well, that is not the artifact we're trying to create. We're trying to build something, right? And so it's focusing on the actual design and the instructions that we're giving to contractors to execute the project is the key. So
Yeah.
I think that within the Revit workflow is really great. I will say that we don't really use Revit to design though at all, and we really, and that has to do with, I kind of talked about fastness, but I also think of I steal a term from communications and latency, right? It's like how fast can I get something from my head out? And it's like the beauty of a sketch, right? Like a hand sketch. It's just like it's immediate. I can get it across. I can look at it. I can see it. I can add more lines to it, and I can kind of do that. And that's, I think, Rhino, handmade models, hand drawing, those types of things where there's just this speed with which you're able to work, and I think that allows just a much richer design process. Whereas like so much of Revit is just like a waiting for something to happen, which but it's fine. Again, is once you know what you want to do,
Sure.
I think Revit as a documentation tool is really powerful, but as a design tool, it's still really limited. And I don't want to get you sued by Autodesk, so don't feel free to cut whatever. I know they're quite a big group, but
Yeah. So, in a multi-generational firm, how do you navigate the implementation of new practices, technological or otherwise?
the thing now, I think that is our challenge is that we have our associate principals and our partners are just as capable at computers as the younger people that we bring in, right? And so if not more so, just because again, they've had 20 years of experience like
Sure.
using these particular computer programs. And so what's interesting now with the kind of multiple generations is like making space. And I think this is something as a leader we constantly talk about is like you have to make space for people to grow. And it's just the reality. Like if people feel stagnant or locked into a particular role, like they're going to leave at some point. And at the end of the day, we think so much of growing our business is growing people. We're a service industry and we don't make goods. What we do is provide a service, and so our value is wrapped up in the individuals that can perform the work, right? And so making space for people. And so just because we can necessarily do something from a technology standpoint doesn't mean we should, right? Like so even though I might be faster or better at doing Rhino, it's probably not the best utilization of my time, and it's probably better for this young person to get into that and do it, right? And that's going to allow them to grow and prosper in their position. And so I think generationally, that's something that we're seeing, and constantly challenging ourselves in leadership. It's like, let's make room for people to grow, and make sure, just not only to grow by knowledge, but to just grow in their position within the firm, right? And giving them more responsibility and everything. I think additionally, generationally, it's again, there's this ability to remain humble is really important. So even though you might have 20 years in the profession, it doesn't necessarily mean your idea is the best idea, right? And so I think we're constantly challenging ourselves to put up stuff on the wall, and remain objective, and try to do that. There are, just from a standpoint of to get into HR and stuff like that, I mean, there are big differences in how young people approach work, and how older people approach work. And that's something I think every business is dealing with, right? And there's a whole work from home thing that came out of COVID, and how you deal. It's like it used to be in our office, like if you weren't in on Sunday, you might as well not come in on Monday, right? Like that was the kind of culture of the office. It was just like really hard. And now it's like we are much more balanced in a sense of how people can approach their lives. We still expect people to get the work done, but it's there's not an expectation that you have to be at a place to show that you're getting your work done, right? We're much more flexible. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely some changes both generationally and technology, I think, in a sense of how we operate within that, but also just socially, and how we run our business is very different than we were when I started with the practice. So
You mentioned a little bit about the different generations and their perspectives on work and how that had kind of shifted and changed a little bit as far as the approach. How does that impact how the firm approaches mentorship across the multiple generations?
we have a mentorship program within our office where every senior staff person has a junior person as a mentee, and they have regular meetings that we try to do once a month between mentors and mentees. And that mentor is there as somebody kind of outside of the particular project. They're typically, we try to avoid the mentor mentee being on the same project together. And it's to provide as kind of a resource to those younger folks, to some advocate for their professional development, an advocate for them within the office, somebody to talk to and bounce ideas off of, all of that. And so I think that's one element of mentorship. We do try to do regular reviews and provide feedback to individuals. We're still a relatively small office, so a lot of communication and mentorship is just like at the desk, right? It's just like sitting down with people, and all the partners are in as much as we can be from a standpoint of being in the studio. I mean, that talk about the work from home thing. I mean, so much of limitation with that is actually the development of just a human relationship with people, and being in the office. I think it's just much easier to like sit down at somebody's desk and talk over a cup of coffee and talk about the work and talk about where they are in their lives. But it's I think we're always, I mean, I will admit we are not perfect as a firm. And we are always trying to improve from a standpoint of providing the resources that we think our staff need to grow. And as I mentioned before too, like as part of when we went to do the transition for our firm, there was a lot of conversations about like, how do you put a value to an architectural practice, right? Like, what is that? What does it mean to purchase part of an architectural practice? We don't make goods. We are service oriented. You could base it on cash on hand, and you could base it on contracts. But I think, as we all know within this industry, like you're always a phone call away from a contract going away, right? So, and then you could get a big project tomorrow, and then is your valuation going to change significantly, right, based on that one big project? So the stability of our industry makes it really hard to say like, okay, this is the value of this company, and this is like, as a partner, like if you're purchasing, this is part of the investment you're purchasing, right? And kind of what we say now is just like, well, actually, the value all leaves in the elevator at the end of the day. We don't have an elevator in our office, but it's just a proverbial saying to just say like, the value of the office is the people that work there. And if you want to grow your office, you got to grow people fundamentally. And where our collective responsibility as firm owners is to make sure we're providing the resources and providing the support that our staff need in order to execute the work, and also to grow professionally. And so, as mentioned, we're not perfect. I think we're always trying to get better, and we try to remain humble and open to ideas of our staff. about how we can continue to improve that way. We are working on our Just certification, so we're very, very close to that. So that's should be announced here in the next month or so. But it's an ever evolving thing that we're trying to always find ways to support our staff.
One of the firm's key priorities is design advocacy to mitigate climate change. How does that inform the decision-making process on a project?
Massive nowadays. I mean, I think Mark Sexton, I mean, he's always been more on the performance end. I mean, the dynamic between Ron and Mark is like Ron's the artist and Mark's very much the guy who's interested in how materials come together and how those perform over their lifetime and all of that. And so I think we've always had an element to our practice where we were really interested in how the work would age. And inherently, I think the fundamental root of sustainability is creating works that people will love, right? And they will want to preserve, and also works that don't fall apart, right? And so they're not transitory and in that sense. So we're, I think, as the profession has evolved, I mean, I think we've been right there. I think we're doing more and more about embodied carbon now, and I think everybody had spent the last 15 years really thinking about operational carbon, maybe 20 years depending on practice, really trying to drive that down and find ways to make our buildings better performing, more efficient, more in line with the climate that they were in. Now we're doing works where we're shooting for zero carbon certification through ILFI and really getting into the embodied carbon approach on projects. And we have a gentleman named Gabe Wilcox who's got comparable experience to myself. He's worked at a number of other firms, and he's our sustainability director, and he's part of every project from the beginning. And we do partner with sustainability experts. Like there's great collaborators like Atelier 10 that we've utilized to kind of bring in the project. But Gabe allows us to have somebody right there at the beginning of a project and really helping us strategize about what are the different opportunities of a particular site or a particular program, and how can we really push to get our client, our users, everything to be at a point where they're supportive of a project that is as sustainable as we can push it, right? And that's always a balance, right? So that's always this thing where, you know, ideally if you had your druthers, you do everything you can, but clients have budgets, right? And they can't necessarily afford everything that you might want to do from a sustainable perspective. But I think that's where you have to get into looking at the value and looking at the benefit and making sure that you're being as smart with the things that don't cost money as you possibly can. So, and going from there. So it's right at the forefront of all design process, and we do our own energy analysis at this point, and we're modeling carbon and doing all of that to really try to understand what the impact of our projects are.
So as we close this out, what new technology do you think holds the most interesting promise for the profession?
I think where most of the conversation is right now is with AI. Obviously, I think we're right at. I mean, I think we're still in its infancy. I think things are starting to get a bit more robust, but to me, it's still a little bit like it's when the personal computer first got announced, right? And like nobody quite knew how it was going to impact their job, but they knew it was going to have an impact.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of right there with AI, where we've kind of started to open the Pandora's box a bit, but we don't quite see how exactly it's going to be the most influential in our kind of work processes. And so I think that's going to have some impact. And I personally have always viewed technology as more augmentation as opposed to replacement. and so like I think to me where technology has its most strength is where it's able to add to your process and able to expand what you can do, expand what you can offer, and then make you faster and more facile at designing. And I think there are a lot of things in AI that show that promise. There's concern, obviously, with respect to it being more on the replacement side. I think everybody has some issues with that, but I think that's for the profession to determine to some degree, right? And so I think the future, we'll see kind of where it goes. I personally, I'm really I love there's some I guess what they're called kind of evolutionary solvers where whether it be like a Galapagos or some of these other tools where you are able to analyze fitness within a particular system, right? And so you're able to put together a particular form or particular structure and analyze it for performance and other things, and from that the best 10 options get kind of put forward, and those get crossed bread, and then from there thing. And I see that more not necessarily as a deterministic thing, but actually as a way to kind of define a space with which in you can go as a designer. And so this kind of design space, it's like what's interesting about these tools where you can iterate so quickly, or the computer is able to like process so many things and put out so many things, is like it's like gives you a sense of the bounds with which your creativity can go. And so there might be opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily assume or kind of predict that kind of become things you might explore, and whether they're relevant or not, I mean, that's for the person to explore. But I think to me that's those things are really excited. They're kind of limited a few years ago just by processing power. There's only so many variables you could
Sure.
push in, and only so many ways you can kind of test fitness of a particular solution. I think those things are getting more robust nowadays. So that excites me. And again, I just again somebody who loves work process and like just in a sense of like going through lots of options and just really kind of digging into things. And I think
Exploring those.
that ability to like broaden the possible solution area is really interesting to me. So
Well, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to share your insights with me and with our listeners. Until next time, this has been As Built.